Deep in the heart of a forest, where the trees stood like silent watchers and the wind carried the scent of burning metal, Charles worked at his forge. His hammer rang out in the darkness, shaping steel in ways no mortal hands should. His eyes, once a warm shade of brown, were now pools of black, void of humanity. They were the price he had paid when he sold his soul to the devil. He had not done it for greed, nor for power. He had done it for love. Long ago, before his hands were stained with soot and sin, Charles had been a simple blacksmith in a quiet village. He had a wife, Lillian, with hair like spun gold and a laugh that made even the hardest days bearable. They had planned a life together, a home, a family, years of peace. But fate had been cruel. A sickness swept through the village like an unseen fire, stealing breath, breaking bodies. It took children, elders, and worst of all, Lillian. Charles had prayed. He had pleaded. But when the gods remained silent, he turned to something darker. One stormy night beneath the old oak at the village's edge, he whispered the words no man should ever utter. The devil came, wreathed in smoke and shadow, his smile sharp as a blade. "A soul for a soul," the devil had said. Without hesitation, Charles agreed. Lillian returned, her skin warm, her breath steady. She awoke in their bed as if nothing had happened, her eyes filled with love, unaware of the cost. But Charles knew, and so the devil took his due. His soul burned away, and in its place, something else settled, something empty, something cold. His hands, once meant to build a future, now only created weapons of destruction. The forge became his prison, the knives his legacy. He was no longer a man. He was a servant, bound to shape steel for the wicked. But Charles had been patient. He had listened. He had learned. The devil, in all his cunning, had overlooked one thing. What greater weapon could there be than the one wielded by a traitor? For years, Charles worked under the weight of his curse, forging blades meant to serve his master. But in secret, he crafted something else. A knife unlike any he had made before, one that pulsed with something deeper than darkness. One meant to cut through the very essence of the being who had claimed his soul. Tonight, it was ready. The forge burned hotter than ever, its flames licking at the wooden beams of his shop. The air was thick with the scent of molten metal and old magic. Charles stood over his final creation, turning it in his hands. The blade shimmered, not with fire, but with an eerie silver glow, one that the devil would not recognize until it was too late. A gust of wind swept through the shop, and with it came the smell of sulfur. Shadows deepened, twisting unnaturally. Then, a voice like crackling embers filled the space. "Have you finished my next masterpiece, Charles?" The black-eyed smith did not flinch. He turned, holding the knife loosely at his side. The devil stood before him, a towering figure of smoke and charred flesh, his grin wide and knowing. "I have," Charles said, his voice even. He held out the knife, watching as the devil reached for it with clawed fingers. The moment the blade touched his flesh, the world shuddered. The devil's grin faltered, his eyes flickered with something rare. Surprise. The knife drank in the darkness, slicing into his very being. His body convulsed, cracks forming along his obsidian skin. "What have you done?" the devil hissed, his voice no longer amused. Charles stepped closer, pressing the blade deeper. "I made this one for myself." The forge roared behind him, its flames reaching higher as the devil's form began to collapse inward, as if the very shadows he commanded had turned against him. He snarled, clawing at the blade buried in his chest, but it would not let go. With one final breath, the black-eyed smith whispered, "You should have never taught me how to make weapons." And as the devil crumbled into ash, Charles took his first free breath in years. Or so he thought. The forge fire dimmed. The air grew cold. And then, the pain struck. It was slow at first, like molten iron seeping through his veins. Then it surged, burning, twisting, remaking him. Charles fell to his knees, gasping, his black eyes widening in horror as the truth set in. The curse had never been to serve the devil. It had been to replace him. His flesh darkened, cracking like scorched earth. His fingers curled into claws. The forge behind him roared back to life, but it was no longer his. It was something greater, something eternal. The shop was gone. The woods were gone. Only darkness remained. And in that void, Charles finally understood. The devil had never feared betrayal. He had simply been waiting for a worthy successor.